Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Maria Murphy, and I'm the Interim Associate Director here at the Alice Paul Center at Penn. And I would like to begin our event today with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement, for anyone who may not be familiar with the practice, often takes place at the beginning of lectures, ceremonies, and public events such as this keynote talk. To acknowledge is one small way to show respect to Indigenous peoples and their enduring connection with their traditional territories and its histories. In an effort to recognize both the historical and ongoing practices of colonization, we wish to affirm that the Alice Paul Center and program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Penn occupies the traditional unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape people. We wish to acknowledge the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together in this community that, while virtual today, is based out of Philadelphia. Our year at the center, dedicated to environmental feminisms, is part of an ongoing effort to recognize our own individual and institutional place in settler colonialism, and to better understand and support the relationship between Indigenous knowledges, climate activism, and relations with and within the environment broadly conceived, by engaging these ideas alongside other environmental feminist work more broadly throughout the year. Thank you. Today, I'm so pleased to introduce our final keynote speaker for Beyond Survival, Eco-Feminist Imaginings in Precarious Times. This week's speakers have taken up nature, climate, and environment in really creative and solidarity-building ways to imagine and enact more equitable and just futures, approaches that I think also resonate with the work of our speaker today. Alyssa Battistoni is a political theorist and environmental fellow at Harvard University. She works on topics related to political economy, environmental politics, feminism, and the history of political thought, and is presently working on a book titled Free Gifts: Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. Her writing has appeared in The Nation, Dissent, N+1, and Jacobin, among other publications. She is co-author with Kate Aronoff, Daniel Cohen, and Thea Riofrancos of A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal. Sophie Lewis, our discussant today, is a visiting scholar here at the Alice Paul Center and a member of the teaching faculty of the Philly branch of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Sophie is an essayist, translator, and the author of Full Surrogacy Now: Feminism Against Family from Verso. She is also a member of the Out of the Woods writing collective, whose edited collection, Hope Against Hope: Writings on Ecological Crisis, is published by Common Notions. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us today. For folks who are watching on YouTube and Facebook, please feel free to make comments and ask questions. And finally, I would like to welcome Alyssa Battistoni for the presentation, Labor of Life: Theorizing Labor with and Against Nature.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Maria, for the introduction and for organizing the event. Thank you to the Alice Paul Center for inviting me, and to Sophie for what I'm sure will be a wonderful discussion, and to everyone who is watching for braving Zoom fatigue on a Friday afternoon. I appreciate it. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about where nature fits into feminist theories of work and what work is. But I just want to start off by saying a few words about some of the questions motivating this talk before I get into the argument itself. So first, I want to think about how to reconcile what I see as one of the great tensions of ecological and feminist thought, what to do with nature. So feminism's great impulse is to denaturalize, to show that many things we treat as natural are actually social, created by human beings, and thus something we can change. The thrust of much ecological thinking, by contrast, is to remind us that humans are part of nature, that our social systems, including economic ones, are embedded in and inextricable from the natural world. So how can we take nature seriously, as ecological thought urges us to do, while also retaining that denaturalizing thrust that we get from feminist thought? And the second is what to make of observations at the place of human reproductive labor, often described in terms of women's work, and the regenerative functions of ecosystems, which daily reproduce life on Earth, occupy structurally similar positions in capitalism: useful, necessary, but usually unvalued, or we might say unpaid. And here we can see a couple of these on the left are just New York Times articles, sort of, it's a rough version of this idea, but how that's made it into colloquial discourses. I myself have argued that Marxist feminist theories of unwaged work are helpful in understanding the status of the activities, relationships, and interactions, both human and non-human, involved in maintaining biospheric function in life on Earth. We see similar arguments in recent eco-Marxist theories from people like James O'Connor, Jason Moore, and Nancy Fraser, and others. But so what I want to ask why these kinds of activities are analogous and how we can make that kind of argument in a non-essentialist way. In some ways, I think the more provocative but potentially more accurate title of this talk would be Theorizing Labor with Nature and Against Gender. To think with nature and against gender might raise alarm bells about biologically essentialist definitions of women and trans-exclusionary feminisms, but my aim here is really the opposite. In this talk, I'm trying to consider how to more fully detach nature from gender and attend to the ways that nature materializes in forms of distinctively human labor without immediately gendering those forms of work. And Sophie's work on gestation and full surrogacy now actually does this really well. It's very attentive to the biophysical processes of gestation while not immediately assigning those processes a gender. And here I want to take that general impulse and use it to think through the labor of life more generally in a way, again, that's attentive to nature, but also skeptical of it. And to help do that, I want to distinguish between three ways of thinking about nature. First is a sort of biophysical nature, nature as the material world as it exists more or less independent of human activity, continuous across human and non-human life. The second is nature as it's invoked or appears as a social or moral order, as it's used to justify social or cultural arrangements as how things are. And third is the form in which nature appears to capital, so it's one of the arguments of my broader project, as a free gift, as something which can be used but not paid for. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to sort of consider how these different views of nature appear in and interact in different approaches to theorizing labor. But I wanted to say I'm particularly interested in thinking at least partially with nature 1, with biophysical nature against natures 2 and 3, that is, and trying to look more closely at the relationship or at the biophysical processes that in part constitute the reproduction of both life and labor power and the value that those have within capitalism, while also rejecting the treatment of those processes as free gifts in capitalist societies and rejecting the naturalization of gender as a social order. So, and I want to try to rematerialize and denaturalize labor to restore the sense of labor as a material process involving living beings and more than human metabolisms, while also retaining, again, that feminist spirit of denaturalizing, critically assessing the social relations in which those natural processes take place, and resisting the impulse to root social relations in an immutable nature. I also argue that there are important continuities, not just analogies, between the regenerative and reproductive activities of human and more than human life, however significant their differences. So I'll come back to all of these questions, but I'm going to just go through 3 different ways of thinking about labor of life that I find sort of helpful to think with. So the first is thinking about labor as sort of the fundamental process of sustaining life. And here I draw on Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition and Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which are very different books in methodology, purpose, scope, and many other things. But what I want to focus on is the way they both talk about the labor of sustaining human life as embedded in nature, repetitive and unchanging, monotonous and relentless, utilitarian but meaningless. They both argue that true human fulfillment is to be found in work that transcends nature. So I'll start with Arendt. Her major conceptual move is to separate human life into 2 categories. There's labor, which describes the more than human activities necessary to sustain life. And then there's work, which builds a lasting human world. So she claims that labor is, quote, the activity which corresponds to the biological process of the human body, whose spontaneous growth, metabolism, and eventual decay are bound to the vital necessities produced and fed into the life process by labor. It's tethered to nature, it's endlessly repetitive, it produces nothing but life. She suggests that fertility is labor in its purest form. Labor is not an exclusively human activity. She says that all living things labor in some sense to acquire the means of subsistence and preserve life. And so she says that the figure of labor is animal laborans. By contrast, what she calls work wrenches material out of nature. It interrupts and maybe even destroys life processes to produce lasting artifacts that can stabilize a specifically human place in the world against these unending cycles of nature. So you might think of cutting down a tree to build a house. You're sort of wrenching the tree out of life processes and using it to build a specifically human and lasting place in the world. She says the figure of work is homo faber, man the maker. So then for Beauvoir, second sex is not about the human condition in general, but the condition of the subset that she says is classified as women. But she describes the experience of reproductive and domestic labor in language remarkably similar to Arendt's, albeit with a little bit of a difference. So Beauvoir argues that women, quote, must ensure the monotonous repetition of life and its contingence and facticity. Her life is not directed towards goals. She's absorbed in producing or maintaining things that are never more than means: food, clothes, lodging. These are essential intermediaries between animal life and free existence. Again, the acts of physically reproducing human life constitute merely natural functions. They constitute a sort of biological destiny. Here too, the labor of sustaining life is endless and unchanging and continuous with the reproductive processes of other species. And she also describes man as homo faber, the user of tools who remakes the world according to his will and thereby transcends his animal condition. So essentially, I think where they describe the same division of labor, Beauvoir argues that it's a gendered division of labor. Women labor, men work. So to recap, for both Beauvoir and Arendt, labor is this transhistorical category describing the struggle to maintain life, which Beauvoir says that women in particular are responsible for. They agree that the labor of life is something to be escaped and transcended in pursuit of more creative and truly human activities. We might say that they theorize with a great deal of attention to biophysical nature, nature one, while Beauvoir criticizes the establishment of a social order built around the naturalization of gender, a sort of nature two, and neither pays much attention to nature three, nature as it appears in Capitalism specifically. For that, I'm going to turn to Marxist feminist theories of labor, which turn attention or analyze similar kinds of labor, but do so in the context of capitalism specifically. And I'm going to look at wages for housework theorists here in particular. So where Beauvoir and Arendt describe the production of life endlessly and changelessly, wages for housework theorists argue that under capitalism, these kinds of labor, what they talk about as housework or domestic labor, produce not just life in general, but a specific commodity and a unique commodity, labor power. Housewives reproduce the life of the implicitly male worker and ready him to return to work each day. By gesting and raising children, they produce the next generation of workers. And I think importantly, these analyses are fundamentally motivated by Beauvoir's concern with gender, what socialists called the woman question. So Maria Rosa de la Costa and Selma James ask in their foundational pamphlet, what is the relation of women to capital and what kind of struggle can we effectively wage to destroy it? And they say women are first and always housewives, even if they also work outside the home or do other things. Silvia Federici similarly argues that the demand of wages for housework is a political perspective that demystifies and subverts the role to which women have been confined in capitalist society. And instead of claiming that the labor of sustaining life, or here labor power, was rooted in nature, wages for housework sought to denaturalize housework and labor. They argue that it's socialization rather than natural inclination that made women into housewives. One is not born but becomes a housewife, to paraphrase Beauvoir. Nature serves as ideological cover for social arrangements. And this is an important distinction between the housewife and the wage worker. Wage workers could distinguish themselves from their work, but housework, Federici argues, had been treated as a quality innate to women. So Federici says it had been transformed into a natural attribute of our female physique and personality, an internal need and aspiration, supposedly coming from the depth of our female character. Housework was transformed into a natural attribute rather than being recognized as work because it was destined to be unwaged. So again, I think this is a really important move. Again, one of the really important moves of feminist thought to show that what we think of as given by nature is a human and social creation that we can change. But in focusing on housework, I also want to draw attention to the ways in which these thinkers move away from the attention to the life processes that we see in Arendt and Beauvoir. And especially the way that the move to denaturalize leaves unquestioned the role to which nature itself has been confined in capitalist society. To define housework as work is to define it as not nature. But why is it that naturalizing work that means that it can be taken for free? In short, we might say wages for housework theorize natures 2 and 3. They critique the naturalization of gendered labor, and they critique the status of housework as unwaged in capitalism, but they leave aside the sort of nature of the biophysical world. So in my third set of examples, I want to turn to the sort of return of some of the sense of nature and extensions of wages for housework, particularly in the work of eco-feminist Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva. So Mies extended the theory of the housework to analyze work done by peasants and subsistence laborers in the third world, arguing that what she called women, nature, and colonies constituted the unvalued foundations of capitalist accumulation, as expressed in this iceberg model that she developed with Veronica Benholt-Thompson, where you see at the very bottom is nature and then colonies housework done by women, again, women sort of equated with housework, subsistence peasants, and other forms of home workers, with a very small kind of above water segment of the kinds of work we typically think of as work, the wage labor of capitalism. And this basic idea animates Jason Moore's idea of work energy that's appropriated by capitalism in the web of life. So I'm not going to go into that, but just it's an influential idea. And Mies charges that women occupy a position like that of nature, and that their labor is also appropriated, that women and women's work are defined into nature. So it's sort of similar to Federici's argument. And here, the sense of life that had receded a bit in wages for housework returns. Mies argues that women are primarily responsible for the unvalued production of life. She says that a feminist concept of labor has to be oriented towards the production of life as a goal of work and not the production of things and of wealth. And she and Shiva together develop analysis of what they call the subsistence perspective, which sets up a sort of dichotomy between life-producing and commodity-producing activities. So what strikes me here is that in these descriptions of a category of work oriented towards reproducing life itself, Mies and Shiva begin to sound rather like Arendt and Beauvoir, albeit with a different political thrust. Instead of saying that life-making should be escaped and transcended, they're arguing that the reproduction of life is wrongly undervalued and under-recognized. They're certainly a lot more attentive to capitalism, but they're flipping some of the other analysis. But so what I want to ask again is the question, I want to return to the question I posed at the outset, which is why does the structural analogy work? Why is there the structural analogy? Why does equating women's work with nature render it valueless under capitalism? Why is life making set in opposition to commodity making, and so on? So to offer some thoughts towards an answer, I want to turn to a discussion often thought of as a wrong turn for Marxist feminist thought, the domestic labor debate. So the domestic labor debate, in brief, was a response to wages for housework and a discussion of how specifically to understand housework in relation to capitalism. So it sought to understand housework not as a matter of what kinds of activities it usually entails, so not in terms of enumerating things like cooking and cleaning and fucking and things that Federici writes about, or by its status as waged or unwaged, or by the identity of those who do it, which implicitly is women, or even by its products, whether that's meals, labor, power, life, and so on, but by its relationship to capital. So in Marxist terms, productive labor just describes whether or not labor produces surplus value for capital. It can be any kind of activity done by anyone. It doesn't say anything about whether that kind of labor is good or bad, if it produces useful stuff in the world, who does it, or anything like that. It's just this one kind of relationship. And unproductive labor is labor that might be very useful, produces use values. It might be very onerous. It might, be work in the sense of what we think of as being onerous or drudgery or something like that, but it doesn't produce surplus value. So that's the sort of one core distinction. And housework is usually classified as the latter, as unproductive, useful, but not valuable for capital. Wages for housework theorists challenged this, arguing that housework did produce surplus value, and that prompts a series of responses from Marxist theorists, most of whom agreed that domestic labor did produce use values for the members of the household, and that those were actually very important, both for human life and that they had a sort of indirect importance for capital, but they weren't directly productive. They weren't sort of in themselves productive labor in the Marxist sense. And I find those arguments pretty convincing. But what's striking to me is that, understood in this formal sense, domestic labor does look like what are referred to as the free gifts of nature. This is the role sort of nature in capitalism and Marxist thought, that it's useful, possibly even necessary for sustaining life, but not valuable in capitalist, or not productive in capitalist terms. It doesn't produce surplus value. So then again, the question is, well, why does housework have the same position? Why is it that so much necessary labor under capitalism takes a form of non-value? Why do life-making activities tend not to be profit-making ones, to use Mies and Shiva's distinction, or maybe to question and try to work, push against, but also think through that distinction? Because after all, Marx suggests that any activity can be made productive for capital. So why do some kinds of labor seem to resist that? And here I actually want to go back, sort of to my surprise, to Arendt. I'm not myself an Arendtian, but to Arendt, who I think misreads Marx in an interesting way. So for Arendt, we had this distinction between labor and work. And for her, that distinction is purely material. It's about what kind of object the activity of laboring or working produces and how long that object lasts in the world. So she says, labor produces a loaf of bread, which might last only a few days because it either rots or somebody eats it and it becomes part of their life process, their metabolism, or you work and that produces a table, say, and that will last generations. It's this durable object. And so that is the core distinction. Her major criticism of Marx is that he fails to make that distinction. He is not interested in the quality of things produced by labor, and she thinks he glorifies what she calls the sheer dynamism of the life process. She thinks he elevates the tasks of basic survival above those that build a lasting world. And that's, for her a problem. She also claims that her own distinction between labor and work maps onto the distinction between productive and unproductive labor outlined by both Marx and Adam Smith. I'm not going to talk too much about Smith here, but she kind of conflates them. But productive activity corresponds to what she calls work in her telling. So their view of productive labor is what she calls work. It's labor that produces a lasting object. And their view of unproductive labor is what she calls labor, these sort of ephemeral efforts which produce only life, which last only as long as the laboring process itself, and which, are not sort of protective of this lasting world. So, as I've just observed, this isn't actually how Marx analyzed productive labor or what he meant by productive labor. Again, for Marx, the definition of productive is a purely social relationship. It's not about the material thing or the material activity. The same kind of activity can be productive or unproductive depending on its context. And he gives the example even of a cook who's working in a privately owned restaurant and generating value for the person who owns that restaurant versus a person who is, say, hired to work in someone else's home just as a sort of, you might think of as a servant or somebody who's cooking their own dinner. So she's right that Marx does see the quality of things produced as irrelevant, at least for the purposes of analyzing capitalism. I think she's mistaken in characterizing his critique as a valorization. And I think that Arendt is wrong to focus purely on the material form of labor. She neglects the social relations that Marx prioritizes and so misses what's specific about these kinds of labor in capitalism. But I also think that her conflation of these two senses of production poses an interesting question about the relationship of social forms of value to the underlying material objects and processes. Because I think the traditional Marxist emphasis on the pure sociality of the commodity form, of the labor form, and so on doesn't say anything about those underlying processes. So what I want to ask is there any overlap there? Why does the Marxian category of unproductive labor appear to overlap, at least in part, with the Arendtian category of labor, if not perfectly, not entirely? How do the material and social relate? And it seems to me that there is some kind of correspondence. Forms of labor which produce lasting objects, we can think here of industrialized manufacturing, have typically been more productive in the Marxian sense than the sort of ephemeral services, which are generally low productivity and low growth. Services, which we could think of as in some instances as sort of the moving of housework activities outside of the home, can be organized to produce value for capital, as we see in the service economy, but they do also seem to run into limits to productivity, as scholars of the service economy, like Arendt Battistoni and Gabriel Weinert have shown. And we actually see that kind of attention to across the various theories of labor examined here, to the sort of resistance of housework to productivity increases. So Beauvoir describes housework's phenomenological characteristics, its Sisyphean qualities of unendingness and repetition. But many of the Marxist feminist theorists note that these serve as barriers to efficiency and productivity. Housework is labor intensive, it's difficult to industrialize, mechanize, or speed up. And the specific qualities of certain forms of labor seem to make them more difficult to organize in service of capital accumulation. James and Dalla Costa argue that if technological innovation can lower the limit of necessary work in industry, the same cannot be said of housework. To the extent that she must procreate, raise, and be responsible for children in isolation, a high mechanization of domestic chores doesn't free any time for the woman. She's always on duty, for the machine doesn't exist that makes and minds children. And the problem of children, many Marxist feminists noted, was the aspect of housework that was in some sense stickiest. Anyone could clean a kitchen, and technologies like dishwashers could shorten the time necessary to do so. But there didn't seem to be a way of producing children without a long period of gestation and labor, which only some people could perform. And here I just want to say that we can recognize that these forms of labor are not universal without gendering their specificity, nor could children be made to grow more quickly. Childcare was difficult to industrialize. Biological reproduction itself was one aspect of domestic work that couldn't, as yet, be shared, redistributed, or mechanized. And I say this not to offer a definitive accounting of certain kinds of human labor that absolutely can't be replaced by machines or sped up or made efficient or so on. Those questions are technological, but also economic, political, ethical. But insofar as certain human capacities cannot be replaced or very hard or very expensive to replace, they run up against, again, these limits of productivity and therefore, I think, to profitability. And I want to argue that the capacities that seem to be the hardest and most expensive to replace are the ones that are most fundamentally linked to specifically human life processes, the processes that continually reproduce the human body itself. But if on the one hand, the labor which sustains life tends not to be as productive as the manufacture of objects because you can only increase the ratio of labor to output so much. On the other, I think the production of labor power is also distinct because it requires time in which labor is not utilized at all. Human bodies need time to rest, eat, and so on, all of which entail forms of human labor. So to eat requires cooking, but also entail the regeneration of cells, processing of food, and other sorts of biophysical processes that operate beyond direct human control. We might say human life processes not only require, but are co-produced with the life processes of sort of more than human life. The production of human beings is simultaneously labor-intensive and nature-intensive. It requires a great deal of labor time, which is difficult to make more efficient, but also time in which these natural processes unfold, which similarly resist efficiency and acceleration. Certain biophysical processes, whether they take place in a redwood tree or a human body, aren't easily reconciled with capitalist temporalities. So this is sort of an argument that certain kinds of activities, because of how they are as nature 1, appear to capital as nature 3. But this is where I want to stop theorizing with nature and return to theorizing against it. I want to be very careful about the potential to collapse this sense of biophysical nature with nature 1, with nature 2, nature as a moral guide, and setting them against nature 3, nature as a free gift to capital. That is, I think we need to be able to recognize that the material world exists, exceeds, and resists the abstractions of capital without then granting them moral status as a result. And I think we actually need to be very careful not to valorize nature per se as a sort of fellow combatant against capital. We do see that kind of moralizing move in materialist ecofeminists like Mies and Shiva, as well as in some of Federici's own recent work. So Mies, for example, argues that reproductive technologies, from contraception to fertility treatments, constitute projects of patriarchal capitalist control, and argues that true liberation is to be found not in transcending the body and nature, but in attaching men as well as women to, quote, these living connections, this dailiness, this burden, this immanence. But if technologies often reshape natural processes in a way that is amenable to capital, they also, at least can do so in ways that expand human freedom, as thinkers like Shulamith Firestone, Donna Haraway, and Sophie Lewis have recognized. Meanwhile, in any case, appeals to nature, I think, are fundamentally anti-political. Any points of conjuncture between appeals to nature and the demands of human freedom are circumstantial. They're not a basis on which we can build a liberatory politics. So while we need to recognize the constraints of the natural world, I want to be careful about that move to then celebrate nature as a source of morality. And in that, I want to depart from forms of ecofeminism that identify nature itself as a form of resistance to capitalism while treating technology as inherently alienating, and on the other hand, forms of technofeminism, which locate liberation in the modification of biophysical nature alone without attention to the social relations of capital and otherwise in which they unfold. If we have to attend to matter, both matter and social relations in analyzing capitalism's organization of our world, we also need to attend to both matter, material, and social aspects of freedom in thinking about the world we want to build. I'm going to leave it there for now. I am excited to discuss with Sophie and hear any questions or comments, but thank you so much. Feel free to email me at this address.
Alyssa, thank you so much for this really nitty-gritty engaging pulling a lot of threads of these terms that have been theorized in so many ways and distilling them so beautifully. I'll bring in Sophie to the conversation. And I just want to remind folks, please feel free to comment and leave questions to Alyssa and Sophie. But for now, I'll leave the conversation.
Hi. Well, I'm pretty sure I'm speaking for the whole audience there for saying that was, characteristically lucid and incredibly useful feeling politically. I think I found it very surprising that you used Arendt, and then as your argument unfolded, I could see exactly how that makes so much sense. And this really is a characteristic, I think, of your approach as a Marxist. Well, I don't know, eco-feminist, perhaps. I think you're also, perhaps eco-feminist is not the term you would claim, but that in itself is a question perhaps to bring in a few minutes. I know you have this category synthesizing xenofeminism and ecofeminism, zecofeminism, question mark. So perhaps that's how I should have introduced you in this remark. But you bring in, this is a sort of characteristically thoughtful, intensely researched, and yet sort of there's always a sense of great potential and never any polemic, even though the consequences of your claims are really very kind of significant, I think, and of great relevance to queer and trans feminisms, I would say. I think those fields in which I have more than a few toes are fields that should really be sort of reading Battistoni, I think. And so I'm looking forward to your book coming out to that end, right? And I guess it's difficult to know where to begin. I have a long history of kind of learning from you and thinking with you, getting your comments on a draft of my book back in the day. And I guess I remember us talking about the pitfalls of entering into the weeds of Marxological and value debate. And you very wisely sort of steered me off venturing too far in without doing, the immense amount of work that it clearly takes to really tread confidently, and that is fine by me. I have learned how we will do this together now, and I've had really interesting reviews of my work that have shown me a little bit that without fully realizing it, I think I was a Weeksian, right? A Kathy Weeks brand of Marxist feminist in a series of debates that I was only kind of 5 years ago uneasily aware of how to navigate. And of course the process unfolds, and you I think are also deeply indebted to Kathy Weeks, as well as to Donna Haraway and all these other kinds of unorthodox, I guess we're all unorthodox Marxists in a certain way, but could you situate, before this question mushrooms too much more, could you say a little bit about your own journey from wages for oikos work, question mark, to your sense of perhaps provisional sort of arrival here at a point where you are ready, I think, to bring forward a new way of thinking value in relation to nature and labor. And perhaps you could also mention whether you see it as directly in communion with Gabe Wynant and Aaron Benanath, who also have these new I think very allied contributions to make to the sense we have of capitalism's present moment and its the likely future for an economy whose limits on productivity in various sectors have become kind of inescapable and sort of truculent, sort of recalcitrant on some level. And of course, it might also link to your role in the the Planet to Win project of thinking about care and its centrality to a post-capitalist economy in terms of its kind of low carbon characteristics as well. That's a lot, but I guess I wanted to open us up by situating you, if you're happy to try and do that, in, I suppose, within Marxism, if that's okay.
Yes, I will do my best. Yeah, well, that's just such a great set of reflections and questions. And I mean, I just, as you mentioned, you've seen me thinking through these things at a lot of different stages. And yeah, so I'll start with a sort of oikos work, or like the move from oikos work here. So as I sort of started off the presentation with, have argued in the past for trying to, or I think this project in many ways started with thinking a lot about the discourse around like ecosystem services and natural capital, and these ways of trying to make economic the kinds of, or to render in economic terms the kinds of services or goods, or whatever you want to call it, provided by non-human nature, like carbon filtration being one, or carbon absorption being one obvious one, but many other kinds. And so reading that, and then also reading, Wages for Housework and other like Marxist feminist thought, and being like, wow, they're describing a similar thing, or like this is describing something similar, right? And then just kind of taking that analogy and saying, well, then if we're demanding wages for housework, why not demand wages for oikos work? And oikos is the sort of root of both household and then ecology coming out of that, and thinking about like what would that mean in terms of either, like actually. Instead of treating these gifts of nature as free gifts, as freely given and not recompensed and not reciprocated in any way, if you had to pay a wage either to the person who was like, planting and taking care of the tree, which is then sequestering carbon, or somehow to the tree itself, or somehow like recompensing this kind of activity. And I still actually want to do that. Like, I think that's still part of the project. But as I like read more, and I think starting off, I was also like suddenly immersed in all of these debates that I didn't know what to do with. And once at some point realized just like there's endless debates to read and go down. But at some point, realized that I was like, I didn't know what the basis of my analogy was, right? Like the sort of question I opened up at the beginning, I was drawing this, like, I was like, this isn't an essentialist analogy. I'm not saying that like, housework or like these kinds of gendered forms of labor are more natural, because like I know that's bad, but I'm just saying they're like in the same place. But then I was like, well, why like what can I do? I need to like ground this a little bit more. And that kind of just took me further down both in reading, and then reading both more in eco-Marxism and Marxist feminism, and trying to get at more of like what was going on there, while also being trained in a political theory program where we read people like Arendt, who I probably wouldn't have like read otherwise, and who I disagree with on like a lot of stuff, or actually most things, but sometimes find like interestingly wrong, as I guess I said here, or at least like is coming at things from a really different perspective, but in a way that can push is sometimes like reading people who you think are really wrong is like at least helpful in pushing you and thinking about the familiar debates in a new way. And I guess the thing I struggle with sometimes still in Marxist thought is the absence of, and we've talked about this a lot, but the absence of like a biophysical nature, or like the material world from a lot of it, because it is so focused on the abstractions and the social relations and like capital, what capital is doing, and capital is kind of like ignoring nature a lot of the time, or like it is a non-value, I think. So it's like, this kind of, in the language of neoclassical economics and externality, but also just like is absent from a lot of Marxist thought too. And so that is like, at some level, it's like, well, why? I need to understand why this is more. And also like, how can we bring some of that back in, not to have either just like the total abstractions of like some Marxist thought, or like a kind of total new materialist, like, Latour et al., move, and how can we like restore that kind of like sense of the like matter material that you get from like a Latour and like people like Haraway, who I think are much closer to the obviously like Marxist feminist perspective. And I think like Marxism is getting better at that as people are more like, oh yeah, we should think about like ecology and nature and whatever. And the revival of Marxist feminism, I think, has also helped and things like that. So, but yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up. And I was like sending this to you sheepishly. I was like, wow, I'm going to give this presentation. It's like, we need to go back to the domestic to labor debates. After I was like, Sophie, don't go down that rabbit hole, like, whatever. And, I also think that there is to some degree a limit, or like you can, I think it's both helpful in analyzing, but it is, it's not like you then just like derive politics from that, where it's just like, well, okay, this is unproductive labor, so we're not going to organize it or something, like it doesn't mean that you don't also, that I think that like the if you focus like purely on sort of like the place of labor and value production, like you can miss a lot of what's important about labor politics, and also the ways that these are not, that we can present them as very clear cut. But what's interesting is I think a lot of the places where they become murkier, and I think that's what's so interesting about, your work on gestation, is that like this is one of the places that I think that like human labor, like gifts of nature, like crash is really happening. It's so intense, and it's really, I think, fascinating. And I don't have like fully worked out what to do with that, but it seems really important to me. And I remember one of the reviews of your book said something about like, oh, like the like gestation is like a cabbage patch. And I was like, no, it's not. Like it's just like obviously not. Even if there are some things that are like, there's like a natural process at work, but it's not like, or like natural process, whatever. But it's not the same. So like trying to figure out how much to like recognize. I don't know. I think I'm like, how can we like be attentive to this stuff and also reaffirm like differences and important differences, including what I think are most important, like that like political differences, which is that like human laborers, whatever their like status in relation to capital, can do political stuff. And that is like one of the big problems of thinking about how do you demand like wages for oikos work for like the tree. So anyway, that was going on a bunch. Yeah, in terms of like a planet to win argument. So I mean, yeah, a lot of what so just to, for people who aren't familiar with this, is probably most people, because I don't assume anyone has read anything in particular, but so in A Planet to Win, this book about like arguing for the Green New Deal, or a version of a Green New Deal that I co-wrote, in our labor chapter, we're arguing that for thinking about things like care work as a form of green job, that can be like a low carbon way of improving human life. I would also say for like limiting those forms of work as well, and like less work as also part of a sort of, I guess, like eco-friendly vision of work. But I think one of the things there is like, the book is both trying to like say, what can we do as a, like a climate reform project, basically, like what can we push the boundaries of within capitalism without assuming that we will overturn capitalism to start decarbonizing, while also trying to push in a beyond capitalism direction. And I think that care work is one of the interesting places for that, because there obviously is a huge demand for care, is, we obviously can like, there can be some amount of care provision and like waged care labor and things like that in capitalism like that exists. But at some point, I think there are also a lot of forms of both the extent of and quality of and like kind of relationships that we expect from care that actually are very hard to reconcile with the imperatives of accumulation. And Gabe's book is, really shows a lot of that, or is trying to explore some of this. With my friend Gabriel Wynant's book, The Next Shift, which is about like the transition from this kind of model of like industrial steel production to healthcare work, and both what that, that's both like we can organize care workers is not like the end, the end of like labor politics that is sometimes imagined, and that like the end of the industrial male worker imaginary. It's like, I don't want to be like, that's the only real form of work in this. But that there's something like, like big industrial profits are not being made. And like, well, I mean, in the healthcare sector to some extent, but it's well, I shouldn't speak for like all forms of sort of services in general. That's like maybe a little bit broad. but once you get into the things that are these like labor intensive and I would say nature intensive kinds of work, I think there are like real challenges. So anyway, I'll just leave it there for now.
No, that's fantastic. Well, I get to do this. It's my conversation with you, isn't it? So yeah. I guess I wanted to just say I have this wonderful sense of constant, like, bitchy synchronicity between you and me, and both in terms. So I have just taught a course on Sarah Faris's book Femo-Nationalism in the Name of Women's Rights, which might sound like an unlikely pairing, but part of her theorization has to do with you may be familiar with it or not, but it's in Europe in the wake of various 9/11 and then very kind of racialized, culturalized mass instances of sort of sexual assault in Germany. There's this kind of rise of certain kinds of racist feminism, femocracy, and femo-nationalism. And one of the things that is so interesting about her political economy account of this, which is using many of the same genealogies you are, although not the ecological component, but nevertheless, it's so interesting to think about the resonances here between this kind of, so that the post-Fordist femocrat speaks, as it were, to the non-Western or migrant, often Muslim woman, to allow her, stuck in her Fordist moment, to enter into the society as a cleaner, a carer, a paid, a waged domestic worker, which then Faris in the very last pages very tantalizingly links actually to a notion of the naturalization of the hijabi woman, who capital needs to unveil so that she can circulate properly. And so this really. This seems to me to be the kinds of dialogues between, supposedly, eco kinds of politics and politics that have to do with migration and nationalism that really need to be happening more. Obviously, I mean, I'm speaking at myself really because I used to be with you in environmental politics and humanity, and I sort of drifted somewhat away because there's also a deeply depressing character of the thought project of apprehending the catastrophe that is our present production of nature, right? Yeah. And then in a week's time, I'm offering a course on Shulamith Firestone, who's kind of who you mentioned at the end. So again, the synchronicities are just extraordinary. And I think, with Firestone, this is a over 50-year-old text now, right? It's just extraordinary to think about. And she wrote it when she was 24. And there is so much brilliance and also so much contradiction and so much that is just, straightforwardly to be discarded and in fact opposed, right? But there is yet this kind of sort of xenofeminist communist residue. The thing that really kind of works and then immediately fails is her sense that to say that something is natural is not perhaps as scary for feminism as there is still a sort of consensus that it naturally, I just said naturally. Yeah. So,
it's so hard to not say nature all the time. It's just why I was like, I have to take a stop. Like I used to just be like nature. I was like, no, I just have to talk about different kinds of nature or whatever, because it's like impossible to not use as a term. I mean, not impossible. People do it, but like I can't function without it, basically.
Right. And I think, I don't want to, this is becoming very kind of, self-involved of me, but the parallels with the question of kinship and family. Haraway said a few decades ago that she was sick to death of kinship, and we let's just the problem really is already in that term. And I see something very Harawavian in your moment in this talk where you say this is more than analogy, right? The continuities between so-called natural capital and woman are not just a metaphor, an analogy. And this is Haraway speaking, I think. This is semiotic material. And actually, Faris is the same. She insists, sorry, this is jumping around now, but Faris says, the analogy between white supremacist nationalisms and certain feminisms historically is not an analogy. They were the same thing at various points, which is a difficult pill for many feminists, myself included, as a European white one, to swallow, really, because it's not how we're taught history, right? Feminism is a synonym for good politics, really, when actually I think the category is capacious enough to sort of contain within it sort of actual enemies, right? And you've taught me this as well.
Absolutely.
But so having done that detail,
no, this is fabulous.
Yeah, it is. So Firestone sort of articulates this astonishing moment on the first page where she says, what, it is nature that is the root of women's oppression, and I don't care. We're just gonna remake it, right? And and unfortunately, it's then riddled with problems. She thinks that pregnant flesh is disgusting. That's a real downer and a real problem in her argument. It stymies her. There's also lots of contradictory echoes throughout the book where she says natural to mean good, right? She thinks there aren't any queer people in the world, and anyway, I could go on and on, but the same moment occurs when I was defending my PhD about surrogacy, and there was this fear beautifully, vulnerably expressed by my examiner, but we can't bring biology back in. It's not safe. This was literally, actually, I think that in so many words, what was expressed to me. And you are, I think, doing the work so responsibly of sort of show, this needle you're threading of caring about nature, using it advisedly, understanding all the risks, and developing it for the purposes of, I would, optimistically say, a revolutionary sort of, if you like, trans feminism, right? A queer a cyborg feminism. If people don't like that word, I'm the last person. I'm the last person on earth who likes that term. Cyborg ecology.
I still think the cyborg is, I think still usable, but I get the, there's limits. But I mean, I'm like so glad that you think so, because I was also very nervous. I mean, I think I've been nervous about it in different ways and stages throughout this project. Like when I was first making this analogy, which I was like, it's just an analogy. I was still like, is that too much? Like to say that there is even like an analogy. And then I was like, no, it's fine. I'll just say it's like structural. But then the more I felt like, I don't know, I think both reading, I mean, I sort of frame my concept for in terms of reading more, like getting more into some of the Marxist debates, but I think then also like reading more ecological literature, you're like, well, how, like, there is a real challenge in reconciling this with a lot of feminist thought. Like it's, not that all of feminist thought is like saying the exact same thing, but I think it's very, it's what do you do with that? And Firestone, I think, as you say, is like somebody who's like, nature does not have this power, and also in sort of crude ways at times, or like contradictory and crude ways at times, but like is trying to like, in some ways, like to take some of, I mean, it's weird. She both grants nature like a huge amount of power. She's like, this alone is like responsible for, like biology as a root of sex class and thus like women's oppression and whatever. But it's also like, we're just going to like take it, we're going to take that power away. We have the power now. And so it's also very like, kind of like human domination of nature, all of the things that now are bad, or like have always been bad in some sense. But like that, I think like we would have a critique of, obviously. And I have a critique of, certainly, but it's like, I think it's like always like how to reconcile the competing impulses of like finding some part of that very attractive. And then also being like, oh, but this is like a terrible, like in my, like with like my eco theorist hat on, I'm like, this is terrible. Like the domination of nature is like is a problem. And you see it even in like classic, like kind of eco-feminist thinking texts, like Carolyn Merchant, who like does this whole book about like the ways that the domination of nature is linked to the, domination of women, and like it's like very, well, it's like a lot of things happening in the book, but at the end she's like, no, this is like not, I'm not being essentialist here. Like this is like, and I think legitimate, obviously, anxiety about essentialism, but it's like, how can we, it seems to me important to be able to think about ourselves as like living beings embedded in a biophysical world of other kinds of things and creatures and whatever that we alternately need and that need us and so on. I guess especially in the direction that we need, probably a lot of creatures would be like, whatever, they would develop some different kinds of like other living things, would or would not be in the same state, whatever, like would have different relationships with or without human beings. I don't need to go down that road, but like whatever, that there's like that is something that's important to think about without that then having to then determine something about like what the structure of human society and everything about human society is. And that we can acknowledge that without then having to like say, well, that means that we have this view of gender, for example, or like who does what kinds of work, or like how that kind of work is organized, or like all of these other things that I think are actually about different things. So, anyway, it's hard to it's hard to do, or it's hard to figure out how to exactly like get that thread that needle, and I feel like I'm seeing more work that is trying to do versions of it, and that's exciting to me. And not that it's like, I don't know, I don't think we're going to get to like a final word on what exactly like the balance of like xeno and eco-feminism is, or if those are even the right terms, or like whatever, or how exactly like we as humans or different kinds of humans or whatever relate to nature in general. But yeah, I'm trying to like get into that more.
Yeah.
Without, obviously then, while also being like very, very desirous not to go down anything that could be construed as like a turf road, because I don't.
Well, I was actually wondering if we should touch on this just briefly at least. Because I love this phrasing you hit upon, nature materializes in forms of distinctively human labor without immediately or automatically gendering those forms of work. And I think this is a sort of actually, I'm going to bring in another person, a fellow traveler, another Marxist feminist, Emma Heaney, who I've been in dialogue with and sort of realized that my, if you like, methodological approach. So I heard echoed in your explanation just now, bracketing woman almost to look at the work. So you use this phrase to explain how you want to get at housework, an almost impossible task given how almost inextricable it seems to be from the very kind of production of the nature category that is gender. But you said you want to bracket it, and this is kind of what I did with looking at the gestational labor workplace, both waged and unwaged, in full surrogacy now, and I realized that, to my surprise, the sort of political conclusions are really close to that of this completely different project, which almost was doing the inverse, if you like. So Emma Heaney used, rather than bracketing the category woman, and she obviously not obviously, but she's working in the field of literary studies, not ecological political theory, or whatever the hell my discipline ever was or is. But she looks at how the sexology, scientific sexology, and modernist allegory produced a sense of sex as cis, and this builds the foundation for an account of how feminism became cis. But her operative category is woman as a mobile field of identifications, whereas I sort of decided, because of this form of work that I'm looking at, which is so overwrought with gender, with the sign of woman, that it was only, to my mind, generative to kind of go at it. Or it was a sort of, there's this kind of maybe almost Firestonian kind of blinkered childlikeness sometimes, I think, that can be helpful, and agnosticism about how gender gets into certain kinds of processes. And looking at gestating without sort of almost with an agnosticism about why it should relate to the division of gendered labor. So I don't know if I'm making any sense, but there's this kind of there's something I see as in affinity here between your willingness to almost so perhaps this is too far, but the term bioessentialist or essentialist is often held up as the worst thing that a theory could be, I suppose, or one of the worst, a bad thing certainly. And I think the possibility here of a kind of a Marxist science, which is another tradition you are in. I think you're in a tradition of sort of scientists who are willing to see nature as mobile, in flux, unknown, potentially in transformation with history as one of its guiding kind of forces, and or at least, I don't know, not guiding, but
yeah, okay. I know what you mean.
So perhaps you could even say, look, bioessentialist, we don't really know what that means. We don't really know what the referent is. We don't need to be, I keep returning to this phrase, we don't need to be so scared perhaps of the biological, because guess what, we're not really sure how it even came into being without language.
Yeah,
I kind of fell down at the end there, but I think you can rescue me.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I mean, I'll look up Emma Heaney's work. It sounds really great. And I'm really, the kind of agnosticism is definitely how I have approached it. I mean, I really like the idea of that the reference of biology is not something stable, or we don't have to, that's not something that we are importing automatically by talking about like the biological or biophysical or whatever, these sorts of like combinations of like, also the way that like biological has been like portioned out as like one part of the like kind of more than human material world, and like the physical and the geological, even though those are not like actually fully separate either. Anyway, so there's like a lot of like permeation throughout. But I really, so in some ways I'm sort of bracketing gender in part because I feel like I'm not equipped or like not like, I don't want to say qualified. Qualified is like a too like qualificationist term, but like whatever. Like I feel like unprepared to offer like a full theory of like gender and gendered labor, because I'm coming at it from such a kind of not gender perspective. Or I guess I'm coming at it from like, how do we think about nature and capitalism? And then I'm like, oh, well, I've been using Marxist feminist thought to like help me understand this. Like, how does this then like fold back in, or like what does that do for how we think about these theories of work? And so I'm not theorizing gender in the project. And so when I got to this, I was like, I feel like I can't do I can't do justice to theorizing like what I think gender is or how I think it operates in labor. So I'm going to just say like, I'm not even talking about like gendered labor. So I think actually labor is definitely, like, I don't want to say labor is not gendered, because I definitely think it is. I just want to like say that it's not necessarily gendered by the fact that like we see this particular form of like, process at work. And also that like, even though I think nature, or when we think about nature and gendered labor, we do tend to think about like these kinds of work that are associated with like women's work, or that are like feminized labor or whatever. But obviously there's nature at work, like natural processes are at work in all kinds of labor, as you point out in your book. When we talk about people using like muscles or brains or whatever, we're not like, oh, you're selling your body only when people sell their like wombs or you know, when they're like selling sex or whatever. So so obviously like nature or this kind of like more than human physicality is present in all of our forms of labor and interacts with gender in different ways. I just feel like I'm like, I can't do the full gender analysis. So I've been kind of, it's kind of my like shortcut or something. But I want to at least, I feel like I want to, in the book, which I also would like to come out soon. I'm like working for so long. I feel like we've had like so many conversations at different points over like many years where I'm like, and I'm like still like plugging away. One day it will come out. But I do want to at least like be more, I mean, I try to at least like kind of a brief discussion of it here, but to just be like very clear about where gender is and is not entering, and just like why I'm bracketing in it, what I think, at least some tentative thoughts about what I think we might follow from that, without just being like completely like, I'm not going to talk about this at all. I don't know. So like, this is really helpful in terms of thinking about how I could at least like do that a little bit more explicitly. But I also think that this is a place where like the non-bioessentialism is interesting also, in the kind of like, you know, speaking of like porousness or whatever, is like thinking about the like there's, so this came up for me when you were talking about Firestone, but like the ways in which she's like very, like she is so much in the kind of Beauvoirian, like Arendtian, like transcend nature and like get away from things that remind us of like other kinds of like animals. But I think that there's something in the kind of non-bioessentialism that's like, we don't know, like it's not stably gendered. It's not even stably like species. Like, I don't know. We don't necessarily know what, like, you know, we can't derive from like a particular biological process, like everything about what, you know, what kind of being that's happening in, under what circumstances, you know, in what relationships, all of that. So I don't have a full theory of that either, but it's something that I think is, or like the things that some of these theorists find like very scary, like the potential that certain kinds of work are like not only things that humans do, I think is very like interesting, potentially exciting, or something to like think with more.
Yes. And I suppose, okay, I mean, yeah, I forgot to mention Emma Heaney has this great piece just really recently out entitled "Is a Cervix Cis?" which I suppose was part of what I was trying to say about the agnosticism, and then with this scariness that I suppose even questions like that, I guess you're talking about this kind of the vertigo, I guess, when some of these things become untethered, and you mention, you know, detaching. I think I'm getting these terms right. Detaching nature from gender is part of your horizon, and I suppose, maybe we could. You know, we have a little bit of time left, but we can maybe sort of begin to loosen the frenzied sort of kind of political tenor of this, to think about utopianism and the value of perhaps holding on to the thread in Firestone that is willing to think about you know, some sort of ectogenetic solution to the problem of pregnancy. Marge Piercy certainly makes it sound, to my mind, in her, you know, Woman on the Edge of Time, which is, I think, directly a kind of fictionalization, a sense of a bringing to life of what Firestone speculates about in the dialectic of sex, where you know, the labor of reproduction in the community has specialized elements, with a kid binder who is good at caring for all of the children in the community, as well as a sort of collective responsibility of parenthood, and a sort of slurry vat of fetuses centrally sort of gestating in a mechanical way all the you know, new humans to be of the society. And this is something that doesn't enter into accounts like Sarah Farris's of the, the spatial fixity, the non-cyclical nature of paid socially reproductive work in the capitalist present, and I mean rightly so. But there is, I think, sometimes just a touch missing of that sensibility that I really appreciate about your work, of how there needs to be lines of flight and a sense of what you have a beautiful piece called Alive in the Sunshine that articulates, I think, the centrality of pleasure and joy and abundance to any kind of, shall we say, Eco-Feminist sort of communist sort of politic. And perhaps you can tell me whether there's been any change in your thinking about the sign under which it's productive to travel. Is pleasure something that motivates you? Do you feel persuaded by the sign of abundance or sufficiency? I've noticed that there's a bit of a debate going on in ecological politics right now about sufficiency versus abundance, and when how these things, so I guess just to sort of how do you find yourself responding to these observations, I guess?
Yeah, they're fabulous observations, and they are really something I've been thinking about a lot, because I think it's a place where, in the longer version of this, the chapter that this is coming from, which I didn't get into, but I think one of the big questions, what does this mean for how we think about for freedom and for the relationship between necessity and freedom, I think is really one of the big tensions, I think, between that emerges in these conflicting views of labor and what it means to be free. And obviously in the kind of Arendt, Beauvoir, Firestone vision, it's you get free by somebody else does the labor, or you try to escape that somehow. Either, you could do it technologically, you could do it by hiring someone else to do it. You want to get to this truly human realm of creativity and making things, making a work of art that will last forever for Arendt, or making something that's beyond this, just kind of, feeding the kids every day or whatever. And then on the other hand, you have I find that, it's not something that I don't see how you do that without having a vision of always someone else to do the necessity, to do the necessary work, right? And then there's on the other hand Mies, who's who I find her vision in some ways appealing in terms of saying you have to find freedom within necessity. There's a trying to you can't just escape necessity altogether. But then that kind of pans out often to her just being everyone is I don't know what exactly where her vision of kind of the pleasure and abundance and freedom, I think she probably has one, but that sometimes it feels collapsing, we will all be, she says in this quote I mentioned, kind of trapped in the burden and the imminence and in the body that we usually think of women as consigned to, and it doesn't sound that great. It sounds a little bit which is not to say, I think that actually is a version, a way to imagine that freedom within necessity is possible, and that we can have pleasure and abundance without that having to be fully automated luxury communism in space or whatever. Even if in some world that was not actually a material world, that sounds maybe appealing. I don't know. I don't actually want to live in space. I would like to go to space once, maybe, but I don't want to live there. And I don't want to go there on Elon Musk's rocket, whatever. The point is there's things that we might imagine that maybe we can recognize we can't fully realize or something. And that seems okay to me. But it sometimes seems then the alternate tack, again, it's retaining this very strict dichotomy. There's labor, which is drudgery, and then there's freedom. And inverting the normative polarity or something. So where Arendt or Beauvoir would be oh, it's labor, escape labor, transcend it, and Firestone too. Sometimes I think some ecofeminists, even materialist ecofeminism that I learned from are sometimes I think maybe too much in the opposite direction. And this comes, then the rejection of technologies as being just tools of capitalist patriarchal control, and seeing no possibility of liberation there. I think sometimes, strangely enough, end up reverting to a very like a purely social view of what freedom is that like if you just completely changed so say like with doing housework, if you could get everyone to share the housework, then you don't need any technologies to do it. And like that might be true, but you might also want to do less of it because you have like some like tool that is not like super research, energy intensive, that makes it easier to do, right? Like, and I think sometimes that can get lost in some of the again, like the embrace of only the social without attention to like what like materially that means. And as well as in the kind of embrace of nature as like a kind of nature as, I guess, like comrade against capital, which I find appealing sometimes. I'm like, yeah, like when people share like videos of like a animal attacking like an ATM, like raccoons stealing from the ATM, I'm like, fuck yeah. But like, like that only gets us so far, right? Like I don't think we can like count on.
The Extinction Rebellion slogan, "We are nature defending itself," I believe, if I'm not misquoting. Carry on. Yeah.
That's kind of I don't the one other thing I'll say, this is kind of going in a slightly different tack, but I was reminded of it when you were talking about the different sort of utopian visions of like different kinds of like communal child raising and ectogenesis and things like that. And the one thing I've always kind of meant to go back to, or I do go back to this and I've meant to write on and haven't yet, but is Firestone's like kind of like eco-imagination at the end of Dialectic of Sex, where she's talking about how, like, I mean, it's also one of these places where it's like very problematic, because she's like she's framing the whole ecological problem as like a population problem, and she's like, we just like, that's why giving having control over gestation and childbearing and rearing is like so important to her vision of ecology. But she also says some kind of interesting things about like needing to like actively restore some kind of, or not even to like, she's like, we can't go back to how things were. We have to like find some new balance, like whatever. And, we can say like, oh, there's no balance, whatever, critique of some of the language. But I think that the general idea that we're not going to like revert to like a pre-capitalist nature. We're not going to go to a pre-settler colonial nature. We're not going to go to a pre-industrialist nature. Like we have to kind of make a world with what starting here. And we might want to go and we might want to take kind of inspiration from a lot of things that have that preceded the things that we want to undo. But we're not going to actually be able to just revert. And I think, that's something that many other thinkers have thought through in different ways around nature, but there's something interesting in that as like a kind of, and potentially a more like compromise position in Firestone that's like neither like, I mean, she is a little bit domination of nature-y there, but it's still, I think, a important way of thinking about like, how do we proceed in a world that, has been seriously, wounded, to use actually a phrase from Hera, where she talks about like the regeneration of the salamander that's like had a limb lopped off, and like we need to regenerate. We've all been I can't remember exactly the phrase, but it's like we've all been like injured profoundly, and like how can we regenerate? It's not like you just go back to it's like the limb that emerges is monstrous and duplicated and potent, and that's, I think, sort of what I always envision for the future world. It's like this, like, it's gonna be in some ways like kind of monstrous and regenerative. That's not the kind of like holistic vision of nature that you find in some like, overly ecophilic texts. But that doesn't mean it's not something that we should like do and cherish and find pleasure and abundance in. So.
Yes. I was thinking as you were talking, although this hasn't been a knowledge form that we have explicitly raised, perhaps to our disfavor, really, but how much this speaks to a kind of against white ecology and against the production of nature that is white supremacist, capitalist, and settler sort of patriarchy, if that makes sense. The language you were using reminded me of the sorts of indigenous and black contestations of the figure of the human as a sort of premise for ecologies in that literature, which I know you do draw on in your work. And I suppose, yeah, I mean, we should wrap up in a second, but in your nature one, the sort of biophysical nature, independent of human activity, I suppose that immediately it works very well, obviously, and then of course it immediately also brings up questions about what independence can actually be used politically there, what the independence from human activity can really be known to be, whether there is any independence from us as well as vice versa, right? Because I suppose that's the Anthropocene debate, in a sense, which is also sometimes called Plantationocene, or in the wake of the anyway, I do think perhaps maybe so I will not spotlight comments from the chat, but as your final remarks, I suppose someone is asking about readings you might recommend that would also help us avoid the very salient threats of eco-fascisms right now. And perhaps that's a nice way to wrap up. Are there a few things you might like to say in closing, and then also if you have stuff to throw out that you're excited about, shout outs or recommendations for where people might want to start to become sort of anti-fascists, eco-feminists, or whatever?
I'll briefly respond to your last point, which I think is really good. And sometimes I'm like, maybe I need another nature for natures. But because I think what I mean by independent of us is not like, I agree, like I don't think there's any there's no pure nature out there that's independent of human activity. But I do think, I guess it's like, if we're thinking at some level of I don't know, I do think that all at base, we're always assuming that there's some set of, I guess responses or something that we don't totally control. I don't know, that we might be shaping the biosphere, but that there's still some reactions happening at a geochemical level that are part of what is producing that interaction. That there is some amount of a nature that is autonomous from that's not directly human produced, or so I think there's some actually level of I guess very basic materiality I want to talk about with nature one that that itself then obviously is interactive, it's part of human life and vice versa. I don't mean that when I say across human and non-human. I guess I just mean that it's I'm trying to, I guess, by that, not say anything about, I'm assuming actually there that humans are not distinguished from some thing about the world. Sorry, this is not very articulate, but then I think there's another, I think what you're getting at is that there's another sense in which we use nature to describe the non-human world. And the first nature one is also a human world. It's the world that comprises everything that is human and everything that's not. It's I don't know. It's just so it's almost too basic maybe. So I I need to think more about that because I realize that I sometimes like toggle there. In terms of things to read, I mean, I honestly recommend reading a lot of the things that I have talked about here. Like, I think they are useful. Like, I think that like ecofeminism, the Shiva Mies text, like I think doesn't get. I think in general, ecofeminism is kind of like uncool because it's seen as like essentialist and bad, therefore. But I think there's actually a lot of important insights there, and like figuring out like what we can recover from classic like eco-feminist materialist, Marxist texts, I think is really important, especially because again, like they are that kind of, those ideas are really animating, I think, a lot of contemporary thought. Jason Moore's book is great as like a kind of building on that, but he's also taking a lot of ideas from the Shiva Mies kind of, or like Mies's book in particular. So like, I think that's very useful for understanding like where some of like contemporary environmental thought is coming from. I am, I'm not an eco-fascism scholar myself, so I feel like I don't have amazing recommendations. I know Andreas Malm's coming out with like this big like compendium of writings on eco-fascism. I think it's called like Black Fuel, White Masks or something. But it's like, it's about, I don't know, it's like about, I think both eco-fascism, maybe like fossil fueled fascism. And my one thought on, I mean, sometimes I'm like, well, we just need to think about fascism, because I think sometimes fascism is like, I don't know. I'm as worried about like fossil fuel fascism as eco-fascisms, I guess. Like in the US, we aren't really seeing a lot of like we see fascisms that are not mobilizing the kind of eco things. They're just trying to like shut the border, deport people. Like that's kind of regular fascism that is interacting with a climate crisis that's ongoing. And I know it's different other places. Like I know in Europe, there's like more of a kind of like green brown thing happening that I feel less equipped to speak on. But I, in general, think we need to be, I guess I think about it as like, how can we like be attentive to the ways that these like political forms that we're used to are running into the climate crisis. I mean, are always running into like ecological and natural, they're always sort of engaged with questions about nature and ecology. But I think more and more intensely as we are seeing the climate crisis materializing in very like disruptive ways. So I don't have like an amazing set of recs there, and I'm always very bad at thinking about books on the spot. So I'll probably think of a million things later. But But anyway, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Alyssa. I've really found this incredibly generative and pleasurable. Thank you for bringing us this.
Thank you. Likewise, it's been so fun.
Thank you both. We're out of time, so we'll say goodbye, but I just want to extend my thanks to both of you and to everyone watching. And check out gsws.sas.upenn.edu for other events this semester. Thanks.